Now is the time.
Forever? Tangent. Hold.
Halt.
Hashtag always MGM.
You are approaching the unloading area.
Calm down. AK haters.
But what if it could? Behold the
Disney
majesty of the
breeze.
Sistine Ceiling.
For the kids.
A salute to all theme parks, but mostly Walt Disney World.
Ha! What a cute ending.
Aloha and
Don't Dillo it.
This is Theme Park Thursday with Dillo's Diz. She is Jen.
Hello.
And I am Frank. And on this episode, we have yet another great guest, another author. Jen, are you excited?
So excited. I can't believe it.
No, we've made a lot of great connections in 2025, and this week is no exception. Our guest is an award-winning journalist with hundreds of hours of television produced under his watch. His book, which is an awesome book, is After Disney, Toil, Trouble, and the Transformation of America's Favorite Media Company. Please welcome to the podcast and Theme Park Thursday, Neil O'Brien. Neil, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're just so excited for multiple reasons. Jen and I, we were kids of the 80s and early 90s. I would say dip into the late 70s a little bit. So the time period that we're going to talk about with your book it has always been like information I've been craving over the years. And I love the history and I love all the behind the scenes of it. So for you to work on this and have it out now for all of us to read is just really amazing. I know you put a lot of effort into it. Just talk about maybe in dramatic terms, the inciting incident of what prompted you to write this book.
Well, like you, I'm sort of that time period, and there was not enough information to satisfy my curiosity, specifically around both the film The Black Cauldron, but also its executive producer, former Disney CEO, and Walt's son-in-law, Ron Miller. And so in 2008, I took it upon myself to just start researching it. So 17 years later, here we are, and the book finally came out earlier this year, and it was a labor of love and a lot of energy spent just trying to, as an outsider, just trying to get an understanding as I best could of what the company was like during this time period, and some of the key players during this time period and what they were like. So, so it's my own curiosity that led me down this road.
The time of the research and the effort put into it is really astounding to me. And we'll get into everyone who you spoke to along the way. But at what point, since you have this journalism background and you're a journalist and you have awards and everything else, what part of it is I'm working on this as a journalist, and what part of it is you as a fan, and how the book reads. And I've heard a couple people I know who have read the book who have said this. It reads like I'm reading fiction, and it's not. It's got a protagonist. It's got obstacles.
Yeah.
It reads really well, like I'm reading a well-made play almost. So yeah. So how do you balance those three things while you're developing it over this time?
Well, I should also mention I was an English major, so that was also a function. So the journalist side is really the research and hearing out as many voices as I could, and again, to understand something that I wasn't there for. And also to provide a bit of balance, because there are several incidents that I write about where there are still to this day different points of view. And so I wanted to be as transparent as I could with what I have heard from different people and just let the chips fall where they may. So by hearing different voices, you could sort of pick it out yourself. But then having said that, I wanted to draw people in. It's not a time period that a lot of people may have touch points to. Ron Miller was not a figure who got a lot of press, especially after his forced resignation in 1984. So I don't know, there's probably a good percentage of readers who don't know that much about him. And yet I wanted to pull you into his story. This was somebody, we all talk about Walt and all his great ideas for the future, having Ron run his studio one day is one of those ideas.
Yeah.
So I wanted to sort of draw you in, give you a main character to sort of follow this journey with through Ron, give you a through line of the Black Cauldron, and also this again, like this is sort of the both journalist and narrative shaper. I sort of needed to take a point of view away from that film
Mhm.
because I wanted to present what it meant at the studio at any given point over the course of its 17 years of development, because especially after its release, it tends to be presented very two-dimensionally as Disney's biggest bomb. But in order to understand all the changes at the studio at this time, you sort of need a through line, and that was a pretty good one because it encompasses so much history. But then also, like, you needed to understand that where, why it came along in the first place, how much sort of ambition and hopes for the future were sort of placed on this film, probably more than it could ultimately bear the weight of. So the journalism was the research, but the sort of narrative shaping, which was sort of its own journey. That was sort of the the English major coming back out.
and because it's so interesting, and especially with the amount of time you spent on it, when do you decide in your research, like, Ron is my main character? He's the guy that I'm, and just making all the ties and making sure everything keeps coming back to it. When do you decide that, or do you not decide that in the research and that comes later?
It came later than I expected.
Okay.
So as part of the process of gathering information, I reached out to certain people for interviews, and I reached out to Ron Miller in around 2010 or so when the museum was still pretty new, the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, with the goal of talking about Black Cauldron. And although he didn't grant a ton of interviews, he granted me an interview. But at the time, and it was like when I went back to my notes years later, I'm like, I can't believe where I was at that point. I was like, I'm gonna focus on this other person, and um, and like in retrospect, like as I learned more about him, and as I sort of focused the story around him more, then I realized I needed more about him because he did not grant a ton of interviews in his time. So I tried to gather as much as I could. I've since learned there was at least one other major interview he did. And it's okay. Like, my book doesn't need to be the final word on everything, but in many ways it's allowing some more stories to be told that haven't been told. So, so it wasn't right away. It was later in the journey, because as I accumulated information, his story had sort of the most arc to it. He started off as this, sort of working class kid in Los Angeles. He happened to meet Diane Disney on a blind date. It was apparently a very kind of terrible first date at the end of a very long day of football. They go to a bar, and he thinks like they're gonna hit it off, and instead he's starting to fall asleep, and she calls him square, and like uses the hand signals for a square, and then he ghosts her, which like and he it's only the next day they happen to bump into each other on the train ride home, and that they sort of, he apologizes and they start talking and they really hit it off, and they have this whirlwind romance, and Walt welcomes him into the family. Walt then later welcomes him into the company. And Diane would say later that he was a blank notebook. And because of that, he was just sort of a sponge for Walt. And he would never claim to be like the visionary that Walt was, but he was sort of getting to see this once in a lifetime figure, this creative visionary, both as the leader of this company he was working for, but then also as a member of his family. And I think that proximity gave him different insight into Walt than other people have. And so the story that stuck with me, and Ron told it to me twice was the story where Walt has a screening of Universal Pictures To Kill a Mockingbird with his family, and when the lights come on, they love the movie, but Walt is frustrated, and he's frustrated that he could never make To Kill a Mockingbird and have the public accept it from him. It's it's during the Civil Rights era, and the country is violently divided, and To Kill a Mockingbird, is depending on where you're watching in the country in 1962, it could be a controversial film. And yet, they all recognize its greatness, and you also see in the character of Scout a kind of heroine who could easily be in a Disney movie of that time period. And that frustration stays with Ron through the rest of his time period, and up until 1984, when he becomes CEO and is forced to resign. He's still thinking about that, and so when he decides that they should move forward with this new label for movies, Touchstone Pictures, that many of us know, it's in many ways to answer that earlier frustration that Walt had. And so because it was sort of a through line from Walt, in many ways gave it the credibility to exist under the Disney label. And now we have a major global company with so many brands that fall under the Disney label, but Touchstone was really kind of the first time that happened in a big way. So anyway.
Yeah. And that is, both of those stories that you mentioned, is really what drew me into the book, is that without realizing, maybe similar to when you were writing it, I was like, oh, this guy's the main character of the story. It was a very, to me, a Don Draper, Betty Draper, kind of romance, right? Like how you painted it was really lovely. I could picture it. And because of how Ron Miller looks, he's on the cover of the book. He's, he was a football star, all these things. He played for the 49ers, is that? Or
the Rams.
The Rams, yeah. And that, it just, you could see all of that in this time, even though it's a little earlier than when Mad Men is around. But I got that picture. And then, just, you never think about the idea of Walt Disney screening another movie. So this picture that you paint with To Kill a Mockingbird was like, oh yeah, what did he watch, and what didn't make him think about what he could and could not do, and how his brand is impacting, thinking about the brand back then. It really established your book in a way that I was like, oh, now I know I'm on this journey.
Again, when I started this journey, I didn't know these stories, and yet when I started to try to make sense of it, then a lot comes into focus, and there's stuff that came into focus that you don't even realize the picture has sort of shaped itself for you at times. But yeah, I mean, he, it's not like everything he did was a success, right? Right. But you see in what he was doing within this trial and error, an attempt to get the company to a different place. There are two major transitions in Hollywood after Walt dies. Mm-hmm. The first one's kind of the American New Wave of movies, where you have violence and sex and obscenities, becoming commonplace, and movies sort of gearing themselves towards the counterculture movement. And Disney largely survives that by just sort of putting its head in the sand, finishing up a lot of projects that Walt had greenlit or expressed interest in, and that is pretty successful for a while. But then when Star Wars comes along, and Spielberg, and even movies like Grease and The Bad News Bears and the Superman movie from the 70s, you're getting now a different kind of family entertainment that's a little bit hipper, a little bit older, but still pretty family friendly. And that's where Ron starts to see that people will not turn out for a G-rated movie. And that the latest re-release of The Jungle Book is getting 6-year-old audience members, and at the time, generationally, demographically, you're not going to make a ton of money if you're only catering towards 6-year-olds. And so, because it's sort of the pre-millennial movement, sort of end of Gen X and premillennial. So that's where you're seeing a lot of this trial and error. And I was just in Charlotte at an independent movie theater talking about The Black Cauldron this weekend, and like it made me like stop. And as I was like even sort of stepping back a bit from my own project, what you sort of wind up with is Disney creating a series of what we now call like indie films in this time period, like Never Cry Wolf and Tex. Even, you know, some of these other projects. I mean, Disney was a smaller boutique film company at this time. It wasn't turning out, you know, 12 pictures a year. It was turning out maybe 4 or 5. And, you know, and they were trying interesting things and off-brand films. And again, not everything's something that you may connect with. I watched a few of these films from this time period where I haven't necessarily connected with them.
Right.
But you see in sort of this what's left of that time period, the films that did come out, like they're very unusual for what we now think of as the Disney brand. And you know, it was just he was trying for something different and trying to push Disney movies in a new direction, and eventually he does land his like first mega success, which was Splash under the Touchstone label, which gave us Tom Hanks, gave us really helped springboard Ron Howard's directing career, and it was Disney's biggest opening weekend up until that point ever. And then the second movie, which is almost forgotten about because it's not on streaming and hasn't come out that much, which is this Jessica Lange movie, Country, all about the Iowa farm crisis that was taking place away from the media centers of New York and LA. And it was her passion project, but it very much is an answer to that earlier frustration we talked about with To Kill a Mockingbird, because it is a social issues picture about something happening in the country in real time. There's a lot of, you know, the movie has its Hollywood elements, but in terms of its subject matter, it was really trying to get at what was happening on the ground, where people were losing their family farms. It was leading to a spike in suicide, domestic violence, alcoholism. And so this movie, you know, really tries to capture some of that. And even, you know, even though it's not well known nowadays, it is like sort of fascinating to see that that was a movie that they promoted Touchstone with. So when you're introducing this new label, you know, you have Splash, and that's the easy one because, you know, it's a little more, it's a rom-com and it's got a fantasy element with a mermaid. Right. But the one that they were really trying to say, hey, look at us now, it was Country, and it was that To Kill a Mockingbird answer. And yeah, so that, and I didn't even know about Country's existence when I started this project.
Yeah.
And once I really dug in, I'm like, oh, now I get it. Like, now I get why Ron is telling me that story about To Kill a Mockingbird. It wasn't necessarily because he wanted to make Splash. It's because he wanted to do things that even Walt felt he couldn't do. And so anyway, so
yeah.
No,
and that period, like when Splash came out, I mean, right, I was 10, Jen was 2. So like that early to mid 80s time period when you had Splash, you had the Disney Channel launching, you know, and you had like Mickey's Christmas Carol debuting, like all these things were happening right there that connected. I think Jen and I both, I had been to Walt Disney World in 1981, but Jen and I both went for the first time in 85. And together, that is, and you know, but that was when all these, you know, all these other Disney related brands were launching, and you know, to me, and for years was, what? How come I wasn't that into Disney when I was younger? How come it wasn't, you know, what was going on? That I know I have like a picture with Mickey Mouse ears from the 70s and things like that, but I know that I had Star Wars figures. I had, you know, I had other things. I had cowboy hat and 6 shooters, but I didn't have like Disney stuff. And so it always, I was like, where was Disney during all this time? And, you know, you learn about Walt's death and stuff, but do you see that, everything happened for a reason? You know, I felt like an unsung hero very early in the book was the Aristocats, which is not one of my favorites, but the way you connect history to that movie and this and writing out how the success of that film was, I was like, oh, I don't think I realized how important that movie was until I read the book.
So I confess, when I started the project, I may not have been the biggest Aristocats fan.
Yeah.
And because, it was one of the later films that I ended up watching, and you sort of see some familiar elements within that film. But yeah, it's a very important movie. If you like anything made at Disney after like 1980,
Right.
really after 1970, you kind of owe it to the Aristocats. And the reason I say that is because Walt's brother Roy O. Disney, days after Walt's death, talked to Bill Anderson, Walt's confidant, who he's going to be promoted to production chief, and asked him to shut down feature animation. Back then it was just animation, but and he asked him to shut down animation. And it wasn't necessarily out of a bad feeling. It was because he thought, how can anyone really make a Disney animated film without Walt? And the veterans of that department, the 9 Old Men, people like Ken Anderson, they had been making these movies so long, they really understood. And in many ways, as Walt got more involved in other projects, they were largely doing this with just some supervision from Walt. It wasn't like the Snow White days where he was in every aspect of every film.
Right.
And Bill Anderson basically says to Roy O. Disney, like, if you want to do this, like, you have to put out that memo, because you're the only person that like people would even accept this from. And he said, but you know what? Like, there was this one other movie that Walt had sort of known about, and it's the Aristocats. And like, let us try that one. Like, we have the Jungle Book that's almost done, but let us try the Aristocats. And Jungle Book is a smash hit, and the Aristocats is a big enough hit, and also importantly, economical.
Right.
Made on a budget of $4 million. And so it's a big enough hit that it's like proof of life, not just to keep going as is, but to invest in the future of animation. And I do sort of like detour a bit into the creation of CalArts and sort of the building up of the CalArts character animation program, because if you like movies nowadays, if you like animation nowadays, that story is so important to where we went from almost shutting down animation to now it being sort of a leading medium in entertainment. 9 out of the top 10 stream movies last year were animated. And like, I think even as adults today have a much different relationship with animation than they did in the 1970s. And it's in part because we grew up with more animation around us, whether it was the Disney movies on home video, whether it was something like The Simpsons, or even South Park. But animation is just like much more accepted now as something that it stays with you your whole life than it was, 60 years ago or so, when it was like almost at the brink of extinction. Like, if Disney animation went away before the Aristocats, or even right after the Aristocats, like, I don't know what. Yeah, it might be like the Western, or musicals, where you might get one every few years, maybe,
Right.
But they would be sort of rarities, instead of really now a beloved medium by all ages.
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting hearing about the Aristocats in the book, because I feel like the movie gets kind of overlooked and nobody really talks about that. And it's so funny when I see, when I'm in the parks and I see the plushies for the movie, and I'm like, I know what it's from, but it's such an important part, though, of your story and of the company's story. And it's interesting how, I almost feel like it needs some love again to to bring it back, because it's such a huge part of the company, which I didn't realize until reading your book.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and like, I kind of understand it in the sense
Yeah.
that, a lot of the celebration of sort of the classic Disney films goes up until Jungle Book, because that's really sort of Walt's IMDb page, so to speak. um, and so the Aristocats is the first one without him, right? And yet, it's because it's the first one without him that does make it so important, because it shows that um, Disney can outlive its creator, which is important. Like, it's why, you know, people still have this strong affinity towards this brand. It's why, it's why it's not Jack Warner that we go and celebrate as much. It's Walt Disney, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, The Aristocats is a significant film historically. You know, it has its charms. As I started to think about the film, it has these and I write about in the book like in a paragraph or so, but it has a lot of these harmonious contradictions that didn't really stand out the first time I watched it, but everything from the the cats and the mice eat together. There's jazz and classical music. There's horse and buggies and cars and motorcycles, and ultimately there's this concept of kind of the sort of turn of the century time period that was Walt's beloved early 1900s of Main Street USA, but in this case of Paris, mixing with kind of this late 60s, 1970s aesthetic of the groovy and the psychedelic lights. So it's this film of all these sort of harmonious contradictions. There's not a ton of life and death stakes in it, but it is a charming film, and you sort of, anybody who likes animation could at least appreciate it and its historical significance.
Yeah.
And especially how you mentioned the psychedelic elements, that kind of show up a little bit in another in other work, and in the parks a little bit. Well, long-haired people can show up again in Disneyland, but and again, it kind of was another aha moment for me to go, well, Walt passed in 1966, and then you kind of just had this revolution happening, and how it plays out, and again, which could be as Disney always trying to stay with the time, with history, with culture, could have been I could have equally have sung them during that time, but very, very turbulent waters to navigate, and not just because of Walt's death.
Yeah, no, I mean, the country was going through a lot of upheaval during that time period. And Disney does still hold appeal for people during this time, but maybe it's a little bit more of the silent majority, so to speak, of that time period than some of the counterculture. Although then you have something like Fantasia, which for the first time finds an audience, partially, if not largely, because of college kids who are watching it maybe for purposes other than listening to the music.
Yeah, that was that really stood out to me too, which is something I was like, oh, and really that's when it really became known, because when we were, and I know you have been to the parks, because we're in the tri-state area, so of course we're going to Walt Disney World, but the 50th anniversary of Fantasia in Disney MGM Studios in 1990 was a big deal, and everything was classic. It was the music, and to learn about classical music during that time, but to know the history again, that part of it, I was like, oh yeah, maybe that's why it had more of that carryover from the 70s and when it became popular then, and not necessarily from the 50 years earlier where it didn't do as well.
Well, but I mean, it had an audience then too. It just wasn't maybe as successful as Snow White. But yeah, I mean, it just shows that, I think even in elements of the counterculture movement, there still was an appreciation in many ways for some of what Walt had left behind. But it was maybe more Fantasia than That Darn Cat, although That Darn Cat also was a hit of its time. But yeah, I mean, the loss of Walt was felt globally, and it was felt personally by people. I may have taken this out of the book at the time. I don't, but people kids in class were like crying in some cases.
Mhm.
You know, like he had, especially back then where TV was still, um, you know, something that was in your home on the screen, and the family would gather together, and he would be part of many families Sunday nights.
Mhm.
You know, there's a personal connection to him that when he passed, and he passed fairly suddenly, especially for the public,
Mhm.
some of whom, if they had been following the news, may have thought that maybe there could be a happy ending here. Um, you know, it was a shock in many ways. So so yeah, I guess it's all to say that um, people still had a connection to Disney, even if, and this is not in the book, but you know, even if you look at um, major artists who came out after this, like a Keith Haring or something, there's still call outs to Disney. Disney's still a part of culture, you know, even if you are doing something that's outside the box. And or, you know, if you go to different parts of the world, even if there's not a major film industry, there's still sort of connections to Mickey Mouse or Disney. And anyway, so yeah, so he really touched a lot of lives, I guess is my way of saying that.
Yeah. If we can go back for a second before, because I do want to get into some of the toil and trouble portion, but what are your ties to Walt and Disney overall growing up? We're all from the Northeast. It's played a pretty big role in our lives, but what is your connection to Disney
Yeah, I
prior
mean,
to
so
doing this?
yeah, so I my uh, you know, I grew up and I would go to the parks every so often, to Disney World.
Mhm.
Um, but the sort of magical moment for me, and really like uh, in many ways pivotal moment, was if you, are you where in the Northeast are you? I'm sorry, you like in New
In New York.
Jersey or New
Yeah,
York?
we're
Okay,
in New
Yeah.
York. Yeah.
so if you may even know it, you may not. Woodbridge Mall in New Jersey.
Mhm.
It was 1989, and an animator came to speak at Circle Gallery, which was an animation gallery in the mall, because back then they had those. And this animator was showing drawings from this new movie that he was working on, and we were seeing rough animation of this new character, and the animator was Ruben Aquino, and the character was Ursula from The Little Mermaid.
Wow. Mhm.
And the movie hadn't come out yet, and I was, you know, at an age where I was like kind of like supposed to be growing out of animation, right? Like it wasn't cool anymore.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
wasn't 6. I was closer to 10.
Mhm.
And but it was really like life changing. Like it was, I got to, like I had this now understanding of a behind the scenes nature of animation. Um, and I was also getting that at a moment where Disney was about to undergo what is now called the Renaissance, but you know, it was Little Mermaid, then it was Rescuers Down Under, which was visually stunning. Beauty and the Beast, which was, you know, like I remember I did a behind the scenes tour at MGM of
Mhm.
animation. Like as a
Yeah.
kid, you could take like a
Yeah.
tour,
Yeah.
and the people behind the scenes were like, "Oh, this is gonna be better than Little Mermaid," and I'm like, don't tell me that. But it ended up being Beauty and the Beast,
Uh-huh.
and then it was Aladdin and Lion King.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so I became like an animation fan
Mhm.
during a time where there's all this. I mean, that stuff in many ways now is probably even more popular to kids than maybe even the golden age stuff.
Right.
Mhm.
And I was sort of getting it like front row seat to history kind of stuff, and it was pretty amazing. Yeah, and so that experience really sort of changed my relationship with Disney, with animation.
Yeah.
It probably set me off on a career path of going behind the scenes,
Mhm.
because it was like, wow, like that is pretty amazing. That like, you know, it's not just like cute images on the screen that move by. It's like
Mhm.
there's a process to this, there's an artistry to this, a skill and technique. Not that I knew words like that back then. Anyway, but
Yeah.
but it was like a really amazing moment. And actually, one of my many pinch me moments in the process of writing this book was getting to interview Ruben Aquino years later
That's awesome.
about his time at Disney, and it was like I got to express how much that moment meant to me. So
Oh, that's awesome.
anyway, yeah.
Full circle moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and Jen and I talk about 1989 all the time. I talk about it in terms of the Disney parks, where I was 14 going on 15, and you going, oh, should I still be going to Disney World? Like nobody at school talks about going to Disney World, even though they all were apparently, because they all go now as adults. But that park and that behind the scenes, like same thing of like, it kind of was like, no, I love this stuff, and that's what I want to focus on is similar behind the scenes, just how collaboration, things, whatever, all things pertaining to, making things happen, basically. But
and if I could just jump on that for 1
Yeah.
second, I also love that early MGM, Disney MGM, whatever, but MGM feel.
Yeah.
And like the behind the scenes of television, the behind the scenes of special effects. And like Disney was in many ways like giving us a view of how this stuff gets made. And it, like, especially at a young, impressionable age, it was like, it just really changed my perspective. I used to love to go into the animation building and see storyboards for films that would be coming out, ahead of time, and just trying to get a feel. I remember they would show like from The Rescuers Down Under, like a scene where I guess they were taking some of the computer and the hand drawn, and you could sort of see behind the scenes. Anyway, so yes, like that early MGM stuff, that like early concept of MGM, that was like candy for me. I loved it.
Yeah. Yeah. Same.
We're all right there. No, and I think that's why the book speaks to us too, because like I said, I feel like we have, all three of us have the same thoughts about like what happened here. To Jen's point of the Toil and Trouble, I don't think we have to go that much into it, but going from one generation, the with the 9 and into Don Bluth, you talk about a lot, and just how them trying to work and figure out how to mesh again during this tumultuous period. It is, I'm glad you said like, well, if animation went away with Walt, like, it would be like this novelty almost in some ways. But here you have these up and comers, especially with Don Bluth, who's like, defined this whole other, sector of animation. Like when you were exploring that time and kind of like, what really led you down that path to kind of, I don't want to, it's like almost like a subplot, right, to me in some ways, but what really jumped out to you to really go down that road and explore more?
So one of the things that appealed to me about trying to tell the story, whether or not it was successful is up to the readers to determine, but I loved that there was this sort of 2-tier story happening, and they sort of mirrored each other thematically, which is that there's this generational shift on the executive level from Walt to Ron Miller and Roy Disney, what would happen with them. But then also at the same time, and in many ways for the same reason, there's a shift downstairs at the animation building as well, where the old guard of the 9 Old Men and some of the other veterans who had worked with Walt from the very beginning of like Snow White, they're starting to get to an age where they're looking around and they're like, we need to hand off this like talent and knowledge. One animator I know calls it tribal knowledge. We need to hand this down. We need to pass this down. And so they're looking around and they say, we should invest in the future with young people. And what they wind up with, especially by sort of the mid to late 70s, is sort of 3 different factions at Disney that are all kind of clashing with each other. But I think ultimately with the same goal of like carrying forward this legacy of animation, just with very different points of view about how to do it. So you have Don Bluth, who wants to bring back kind of classical golden age style filmmaking, especially when it comes to special effects, and make the films feel rich. You have the old guard, who have lived through things like Sleeping Beauty's box office failure and know how risky animation can be. And they know that if they mess up and make a film that goes over budget, the whole thing could go away because it almost just went away. And then you have these new kids from Cal Arts with all this energy, really like some people who were like just born to be animators, like Brad Bird and Jerry Reese, who were just so eager to get into it and bring in some of that sort of Star Wars, New Hollywood energy. And yet they're being held back because they're like 22. It's like, are we going to hand off our company to 22-year-old? And so you like, I understand all the points of view,
Right.
And you know, some of these feelings are still strong to this day about how some of those clashes occurred. But I think at the end of the day, they were all trying to just say, this is what animation should be now, right? And again, like all their points of view make a certain kind of sense. Even the old guard, which I think probably gets the worst rap out of anyone, because it's like, you know, it's the least interesting thing to do is to stay the course, right?
Yeah.
But like when you realize how close they came to losing it all with, you know, right after Walt's death, and how close they came to losing it all with Sleeping Beauty, like they know that like it's safer to do the Aristocats and Robin Hood than to attempt something like the Black Cauldron, and they don't want to do that till they feel that they're fully ready to go. And you know, I'm being a little bit unfair because I think they also, if they were able to do it on their terms, the old guard, they would have jumped at it. But like the 9 Old Men really wanted to make the Black Cauldron and to be the people animating on that. But anyway, management for different reasons decided not to do that. Anyway, so that's all to say that the dual storylines, that appealed to me, and that sort of gave it sort of that narrative richness that I wanted to dig into, and I sort of knew that from the beginning. Like that's something I did know from the beginning.
Yeah.
Because like if I'm gonna tackle this and I'm gonna like, you know, do this labor of love, like I needed something to. I needed my own sort of ambition for it to make it like a little bit, at least for me, like a little bit more dense.
Yeah. I mean, I think as you're reading it, you know, there's this weird thing, at least for me, and being a fan of Disney, going on in my head. Like, of course, there's such craziness behind the scenes of a massive corporation like Disney, but also there's this like pixie dust view of it too, right? You know, that people can look at it and be like, everything's magical there, everything's great. And so as you're reading, and anyone who's worked in a corporate environment is like, well, this is pretty relatable. But was there something that for you was really surprising that you learned that happened behind the scenes in the offices as you were researching?
Sure, is the short answer. I think the thing that, and again, I didn't really get this until late in the process, and this goes to the upstairs story now, but I think learning more about Ron Miller's forced resignation, and learning how hard that was on him personally, and how it sort of you know, it really changed things for him and the people closest to him, and I learned that not from Ron, because he didn't want to talk about it when I spoke to him, because again, I spoke to him around 2010. It was still a thing he did not want to revisit at that moment. So after his passing in 2019, I reached out to his son, Walter, who did agree to talk to me, and it was through him and sort of, I think, reflecting on his dad's life, where he shared with me that sort of hardship it sort of took on Ron, and it took him a really long time to be willing to look back at what was a really big chunk of his life. And it really was the family museum in San Francisco and reconnecting with people who came through the museum who he had worked with years before, and realizing that there was still some respect and love for what he had done many years before, that I think helped him open up a little bit about, and open up's not really the word, but sort of make some peace with that time period for him. So that was something that surprised me, because again, when I started this, I didn't know that. He had never really talked about it during his lifetime, to my knowledge. And so to then sort of get that years later was something that I learned at the sort of near the end of my journey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I know I have one more thing to ask you, but it was something that Jen and I talk about a lot on the podcast, and this happened a lot when JPEG was in charge. But Walt was in front of the camera, and that's what people's memories are. And then for Jen and I, seeing Michael Eisner every week was something that gave us that presence of similar. And then even now with Bob Iger, when you see him in interviews, those three, that's why those three stand out the most to us, is because of how their approach on camera was. Do you think there's any chance that Ron Miller would have benefited from something like that, or was he just not the guy for that kind of thing, to have an outlet where he could be, that's something, as I read the book, crossed my mind. I was like, maybe as a kid in the 70s, I didn't know Disney because I didn't have Walt, and Jen was younger for Eisner, so she has that. I didn't have that, and I wonder if he could have been, if something like that could have existed for him.
Yeah, I mean, look, Eisner, the other thing that's sort of worth noting about Eisner is, he came from Paramount with Barry Diller, and they were celebrity CEOs, celebrity moguls coming into, at the end of their time at Paramount. They were on the cover of magazines with the poster of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom behind them, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were stars. So that sort of, Paramount was super hot during this time period.
Right.
There's a famous movie quote from William Goldman: "Nobody knows anything," about how, when you're making movies, you don't know if it's going to be a hit or not. That was true in a lot of Hollywood, and yet Paramount, more often than not, was hitting home runs.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Where other people were hitting maybe singles and doubles. And so as a result of that, Barry Diller and Michael Eisner took on sort of this larger than life status, almost more like an old school movie mogul, like a Jack Warner.
Mm-hmm.
So that when he came to Disney, his stature was already sort of elevated. And I do think his, he was very visible to the public. He also had a lot of success that he was proud to be in front of and let the public know what the company was doing. And I think you see that today as well. I don't know that was really Ron Miller's.
Yeah.
Ron Miller was, from what I have gathered, he was a little bit more of a reserved individual. He wasn't somebody who was putting himself, out there all the time.
Right.
He would do print interviews. He would do, things he had to do for, as in the role of CEO, whether he was talking to investors.
Yeah.
But I don't think he saw himself in the light of public figure the way that
Right.
We saw with Walt, like we saw with Eisner and Iger.
Yeah. Well, and especially sometimes your brain goes to the social media age, or maybe it wouldn't have gotten the negativity, oh, he's just doing what Walt's doing. But maybe, all right, maybe that's not the choice this time, is to be out in front every week.
Yeah.
The amount of, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like in some ways, the time he was working in, like I don't know how some of the choices would have withstood scrutiny
Yeah.
in real time in the current media age. And if anything, Ron sort of still had a point of view of his father-in-law, which is if something's not successful the first time out, it's okay because we're gonna re-release it. We're gonna make money off it
Hmm.
through like he was the first time, and I always associate synergy with Michael Eisner, but um, Ron Miller was looking at a synergism strategy around the Black Cauldron with the theme park ride and
Hmm.
video games and all these things. Um, you know, when the Black Hole came out and didn't do well,
Hmm.
Diane Disney, which is unusual for her, but she wrote into the Los Angeles Times to defend the film because it would continue to make money in re-releases. So very much the same way that like a Fantasia could come out and make back money years later and sort of have that support over the years and eventually get to a point where it is a success. The Disney catalog of sort of the 70s and early 80s, sort of they were still thinking with that mindset. So, um, I think from Ron's perspective, he was willing to forgive a film's troubles at the box office the first time out because there were going to be other plays. There's going to be home video. There's going to be the Disney Channel, and both of which really came to be under him. Um, anyway, and so there was sort of a long view, but then Wall Street eventually was like, well, yeah, but what about right now? And that's sort of where his troubles um, eventually, led to Roy's resignation from the board, and then eventually to Ron's forced resignation in September of '84.
For you personally, I feel like as a passion project for you, I just want to know, like, your level of fulfillment. You got to talk to all these people connected, in the animation world, and getting to talk to Ron directly and the family. Like, for you, like, just what goes through your when you're having these conversations and you're experiencing these moments, like, and now that you have a finished product with the book, like, what is that like for you?
If there have been like many pinch me moments, and the response has been pretty overwhelming from the people who were there at the time.
Yeah.
You know, I got to speak to Glenn Keane over Zoom, and then he wrote me an email after he read the book, and it was like the nicest email. And I was like, "Can I use this as a pull quote?" And that was pretty amazing. Mike Gabriel, who also gave me a pull quote, has been super generous with his praise of the book. And I'm like, you directed Pocahontas, and I remember going to see Pocahontas on my college trip, like to see schools, and like I may have picked my school because I liked Pocahontas that week. Um, and Tony Ansama, who's the voice of Donald Duck, has also been supportive of this project, and he also gave me a pull quote, and I'm like, I'm now like friendly with Donald Duck. That's pretty amazing. And he's been very kind and generous. Um, yeah, I mean, and then in June I got to speak at two Disney Animation. I got to speak to Disney Legends on the lot. At one point I was standing next to Bruce Reitherman and Floyd Norman, so like the Jungle Book was surrounding me and for a photo op. Um, it's been a pretty incredible journey. And yeah, and even just some of the other stops I've got to make along the way. I went to Animation Y'all Expo in Nashville, and that was such a nice event run by the Bancroft brothers. It, it's my first like expo that I even as an attendee, because that's not what I typically do. Just I mentioned it earlier, but just this last weekend I went to this like really interesting independent theater in Charlotte, the Independent Picture House. And I just like fell in love with like what they do for their programming, and I also happen to speak there. So there have been so many moments along the way so far that have just been like, this is pretty great. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, and totally, the time and, and doing the work into it I mean, just seeing it pay off this way and knowing who you got to talk to and experience with, that's really, really it's just so well done and like I said, it read like, as soon as Ron got introduced, and went on the date, I was like, oh, I'm locked into the story now,
Yeah.
and I really just enjoyed the journey that it was taken on, and really appreciate you taking the time here to talk to us today.
Oh, thank you.
I do have one more question. I mean, Frank,
yeah,
please.
You stole my last question of basically your favorite moments of this whole journey, so that's very cool. But now I'm wondering, going from the world of producing, which we could spend a whole other hour on probably, and now being an author, will there be more projects like this in the future?
It's an interesting question. I don't have a sequel already in the works. In many ways, and if there is a criticism I've seen in the book, it's that maybe it's a little too detailed at times, which I'm okay with, because I didn't want to leave too much on the table, because I don't know that there will be a sequel to this. I think part of the appeal of this book for me was that it was an era that was really unexplored in any depth when I started. There's since been a couple of explorations. Like, I did this before, like my journey started before Waking Sleeping Beauty, or at least when it came out. So, I in many ways, the book has touch points throughout the 100-year history of the company, going from when Walt started to really just 2024, I think, whenever the Nelson Peltz activist investor moment happened, and both sides of the family sort of send letters in support of Iger. So, in many ways, I did the company up until this point in my own way, and I not in depth, and I gloss over a lot, but I hit the things that I mostly wanted to hit.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I would love another project where this had so many key elements for me. I mentioned earlier sort of the ambitions for it. I loved the fact that it was this mix of documentation, research, but also getting to speak to people who were there, which is a function of working on it so long, because some of the people have passed, but also because those young kids that we were talking about are now of the age that their mentors were at the sort of nearing the end of their careers. I hope many of them work another 40 years if they choose to. So that was really great, getting to visit and revisit some films I knew really well and some I didn't. That was really great. So there are a lot of specific elements of this that kept me coming back. There were times where I almost put it down and I wasn't sure I would ever finish it. It went kind of dormant for several years, never fully dead, but just, on the back shelf. Yeah. And so I don't know, I would want another story that really fascinated me, that mesmerized me. And I don't know what that is yet. But having said that, I've also learned a lot on this journey, including just the publishing phase and the publicity phase. I have lessons to share, whether with others or myself, for the future. So I don't know, maybe is the short answer, but I don't know that it would definitely be another Disney book.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I think about it, but it's I don't know what that magic second follow-up is. But maybe I'll just do a sellout book and we'll
It's hilarious. Well, the book After Disney, Toil, Trouble, and the Transformation of America's Favorite Media Company will have all the links in the summary of the podcast episode. Neil O'Brien is the author. Neil, thank you so much for taking this time to talk with us. We really appreciate it here on the evening of Disneyland's 70th, but it's probably a little bit later this summer.
That's fine. I thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the time to talk about the book. And I'm so glad to hear that you both responded to it, because that's the other thing. When you work on something this long and you're mostly by yourself, like, you're not quite sure if you're on the right path. And that's even more reason why, like, the response has been so nice from people like you and others. So thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you. The Dillo's Diz podcast is hosted by Frank Cardillo and Jen Cardillo-Snyder. Music produced by Matt Harvey. Logos and video production courtesy of Snidillo Studios. Dillo's Diz Resort is our Patreon with tiers starting as low as $1 per month. You can visit dillosdizresort.com to learn more. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, X Twitter, and Facebook at Dillo's Diz. Check us out on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/DillosDiz. Don't forget to like and subscribe while you're there. We also have merch available on TeePublic and Etsy. For all this and more, visit our one-stop shop, dillosdiz.com. Dillo's Diz Podcast 2025.